So, among other things, Russia claims that it invaded Ukraine to protect Russians in the Donbass within Ukraine. Yes, they're going to get rid of the Nazis and they're going to protect themselves from NATO, but they're also going to protect these Russians within the borders of Ukraine. Well, okay, so if you apply that logic, there's been a lot of Russians that have fled the country. Just before the war, they got out, and then when there was mobilization, upwards of 1 million Russians went to other countries, like Georgia. This is an article from August 31st. Russia is losing Ukraine, but winning in Georgia. There's a lot of Russians in Georgia. Here's another article 2 days ago. Russia, opposed to Putin's war, find a new life in neighboring Georgia. And just one from yesterday. Georgians fear an influx of migrants from Russia after Ukraine invasion. So we're going to watch this 60 Minutes episode, just a few clips from it, and we're going to see how this plays out. So let's hear what they had to say, because this just came out yesterday or the day before.
The day Russia invaded one of its neighbors, waged a bloody war, and seized a fifth of that neighbor's territory, fear and shock rippled throughout the region.
Incidentally, they seized about a fifth of Ukraine as well in 2022 and 2023.
We're not talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rather the small country of Georgia. That invasion was more than 15 years ago. Vladimir Putin's playbook hasn't changed much. Today, Georgia, which shares a 556-mile border with Russia, is still trying to remove the grip of the Kremlin. Days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Georgia submitted an application to become part of the European Union, with hopes of gaining a Western insurance policy to protect it.
Now, remember, what happened in 2014 was that when the president wanted to sign something he was about to sign something with the European Union to move closer to the European Union, Putin wanted them to sign on to a Russian agreement instead, to move them closer to Russia. That's what caused the Maidan Revolution in 2014. And then the little green men showed up in Donbass and they seized Crimea and all of that. So this is an important thing.
Tonight, you will hear from the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili. The daughter of Georgian refugees raised in Paris, she says that Vladimir Putin has launched a quiet invasion of Georgia in an attempt to extend Russia's reach.
Now, the reason I thought this was interesting is because I was reading about in another country about how many Russians there were there, and that they were, fighting graffiti with graffiti because the Russians would put stuff up that was pro-Russian in this other country. And so if you have a large minority of Russians in your country now, why wouldn't Putin use the same pretext that he used in Ukraine to say, these Russians are being persecuted in fill in the blank name of the country, Moldova or Georgia or whatever other country where there's these Russians that have dispersed trying to avoid the war.
The story will continue in a moment.
The war in Ukraine is now moving into its third year. How is the war there impacting life here?
It is, of course, a reminder of everything that this country has gone through and of the fact that it's always an immediate danger and threat. It's already part of the reality that Russia is testing the ground.
You think the Russians are testing the ground right now in Georgia?
Right now.
How so?
Yep. They're doing it in Georgia, they're doing it in Moldova, they're doing it wherever they can to expand their borders and whatever they consider historic Russian lands. Whether that's true or not, that's the way that they're thinking. Go back to my last video yesterday where Sergei Martin was talking about the Russian Spring and reclaiming these Russian lands. They're putting it out on the table now. It's clear as day right now.
Here, their easy way is the hybrid war.
A hybrid war that has included online and televised disinformation campaigns and anti-Western propaganda pumped into Georgia, a favorite tactic of the Kremlin. Georgians have seen it before. In 2008, 3 weeks before Russia launched its first airstrike in Georgia, Moscow hit the country with a series of cyber attacks. The 5-day bloody battle that followed ended with Russia seizing 20% of Georgia's land. President Zor.
Okay, now the world yawned and the world did nothing about it except for say some nasty words. And Putin thought he could repeat this trick in Ukraine. And 600 plus days later, here we are. 300,000 Russians off the battlefield later. This is where we are.
Zurabishvili says the mostly muted international reaction to that war laid the groundwork for Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's plan to.
And that's exactly right. By doing nothing, we have incentivized Putin to do more, which is exactly why he has to be stopped here.
Bring former Soviet republics back into the Russian fold. Today, a fifth of Georgia is occupied by the Russian military, and an estimated 8,000 Russian troops are inside the Georgian border. Across a rickety bridge, we found an abandoned stretch of farmland choked off by barbed wire. Warning signs to stay out.
Oh, there she is.
And a defiant 87-year-old Valya Benishvili.
The Russians have told me this is our land. And I said, no, our land is in Russia. This is our land, not.
That lady is my hero. That is freaking awesome. She's standing up to him.
Yours. You have no rights here.
How long have you been surrounded by the barbed wire?
For 15 years.
Wow.
In 2008, her land was seized by Russian troops. The grandmother of 4 still refuses to surrender her home. Cut off from family, she relies on outsiders and a stick to deliver food and the medicine she needs. She whispered to us that the Russians were watching us from over that hill.
Are you afraid of the Russians?
Yes, I'm afraid of them. What if they take me and detain me? Nobody can help me. I'm alone. When it's only a couple of them, I can always answer them and fight back. But when it's a lot
When there's only a couple of them, I can fight back. That lady is awesome.
of them, there is nothing I can do.
Georgia is bordered on the north by Russia, the east by Azerbaijan, and the south by Armenia and Turkey. The bridge between the Black and Caspian Sea, an important route for natural gas and oil. United Nations data shows that since the war began, everything from cars to chemicals have rolled into Russia through Georgia, some in violation of Western sanctions, a lifeline for Putin's regime. There is traffic coming into Georgia, too. Thousands of Russian nationals entering the country in cars and on foot, extending for miles and arriving in waves, first at the beginning of the Ukraine war in 2022, and again last September when fighting-age men fled Russia's mandated military service.
And I remember watching this as they were trying to get out, the long lines, the huge lines of Russian men trying to escape because they did not want to be part of the special military operation.
But some Georgians worry Putin loyalists could be entering the country too, laying the groundwork for Russia's next move. When Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, he said it was to, among other things, protect the Russians living there. President Zurabishvili fears Putin could launch a similar campaign in Georgia. Since the war, Georgia has become home to 100,000 Russians.
And you don't even need those Russians to be working on your behalf. You just need them to be physically there for Putin to then say, hey, the Georgian government, they're persecuting them. We have to go in and do this, like they did with Ukraine.
It's very unnerving when in your own country you have people that are talking the language of the enemy and that believe that they're at home.
The Russians believe that they are at home.
They're behaving and believing that they are very much at home. So there's a fine line, and that line has to be kept so that we do not have incidents in the future that would allow Russia to use their favored doctrine of protecting Russian-speaking citizens.
So why doesn't Georgia just say no more Russians
That is
through our border?
a question for the authorities.
Aren't you the authority?
No, I don't have the executive powers, and unfortunately.
The executive power to control Georgia's borders is squarely in the hands of its prime minister.
Okay, so the lady that was just speaking was the president, but in their system, the president only has certain limited, very limited powers. The prime minister has the lion's share of the powers, and he's not necessarily sympathetic to doing anything about that, and so that becomes a dangerous kind of thing for Georgia.
Irakli Garibashvili. Publicly, he said that he supports the country's bid to move away from neighboring Russia and join the European Union. But his actions and inactions tell a different story. Since the Ukraine invasion, Prime Minister Garibashvili agreed to resume flights between Tbilisi and Moscow for the first time in almost 5 years. He's also failed to adopt strong sanctions against Russia. Anna Tavadze and Dachimidadze are members of the Shame movement, a group with thousands of young followers working towards Georgia's entry into the European Union.
If Russia wins, it means loss of freedom, loss of everything that we fought for in the past 30 years, basically. It's a fight for values. It's a fight for where you want to stand in this big fight for democracy.
As soon as West in any form, be it the US partnership, be it European Union, is not represented in this country, Russia will fill the void right away.
And that's something that you need to understand. See, this is where I depart from the isolationist type of Republicans who I don't want to have anything to do with that. No, I'm not a globalist, but at the same time, you have to understand that if you do not lead, something else is going to fill that vacuum. So the U.S. has to be a part of this, whether you like it or not. In the last few days, I had my hot water heater replaced, and I had to fix my air conditioning unit. Now, I enjoy hot water, and I enjoy air conditioning, but the price of having that is that I have to provide maintenance periodically. I don't like maintenance, but that's kind of what the U.S. has to be engaged in right now. They have to be part of fixing the problem rather than just ignoring it and hoping that it will go away.
They say the influx of Russians is already changing the face of Georgia.
What are they doing if we look at it? They're buying apartments, they're buying private property, they're opening up businesses. Their actions changed Georgian economy.
The Russians are buying apartments here in every 33 minutes. They're purchasing a piece of land in every 27 minutes, and they're registering a business in every 26 minutes. So I think we're on the brink of a very dangerous situation here in Georgia.
And that could be, but it's actually great for the economy. But if you can't trust the Russians that are in your border, or that Russia won't use that as an excuse to invade you, then that becomes a problem.
According to public records, Russians have registered 21,000 businesses in Georgia over the last 18 months and launched 5 new Russian-only schools, none of which are licensed by Georgia's Department of Education. Russians have driven rent up nearly 130%. Prices for everything from food to cars have gone up 7%. Over 100,000 Georgians have left the country because many of them can't afford to live here anymore.
I've heard...
And those are all legitimate economic byproducts, but the real danger here is that this could become a pretext to invade again, to defend the Russians that are there, or it could become somewhat of a fifth column. And I'm going to put the link to this episode below so you can watch the whole thing, because I only showed you some clips.
This is described as a quiet invasion.
Quiet invasion, yeah. There's a risk of the economic divergence, there's a risk of military intervention, and there's a risk of Georgia's statehood being destroyed.
Emmanuel Lisnev, George Smorgulenko, and Pavel Bakadov don't look like much of a threat. All Russians in their 20s, they fled their country for fear of being drafted or imprisoned for speaking out against Putin. They now live in Georgia and work at this Russian-owned comedy club in Tbilisi.
I said I'm against the war in Russia. I was beaten and after that gone to prison. 3 times.
So 3 times you went to jail?
Yes, 3 times.
I believe and I know that Russians actually against the war.
You think that most Russians are against the war?
Yeah, Just scared, really scared.
Have any of you had any aggression towards you because you're Russian?
Actually, I have a big writing on the wall. It is the biggest thing I see from my window, just big Russians go home.
There is no subtlety in spray paint. Anti-Russian graffiti blankets the city along with support for Ukraine.
And you would understand why if what happened to Georgia in 2008 seems to be repeating in Ukraine in 2014 and 2022.
Crumbling walls, the Georgian flag is joined with those of the European Union, the US, and NATO. Over 80% of the Georgian public backs entry into the EU, as does Georgian President Zurabishvili. But her position has become increasingly ceremonial as the country moves towards a parliamentary government. After she went to Europe to try and pave the way for Georgia's EU bid, Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili accused her of violating the constitution, banned her from traveling to Europe, and tried but failed to impeach her.
And I saw this 2 weeks ago. Here's the Reuters article. Georgia's pro-EU president avoids impeachment after a break with the government, October 18th. Yeah, she flew there and she met with whoever she met with, but it wasn't an official capacity. But again, if he is trying to block that, that tells you a lot about what's going on within Georgia's legislature. And so this could be a big, significant threat. Okay, that's all that I have. I just want you to be aware of that because what's happening in Georgia could be happening in Moldova and other former Soviet satellite countries. And it's a real danger. If Putin can do what he did in Ukraine in 2022, coming in and saying, Russians are being persecuted, I have to defend them. He can do that in Georgia or other countries. All right, tell me what you think. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. Thank you for the coffees. I appreciate that. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.